Welcome to Solarpunk Futures, a podcast brought to you by Android Press and Solarpunk Magazine. Solarpunk Futures brings you short stories, poetry, nonfiction, analysis, and discussion about envisioning and building a new world where humanity, technology, and nature coexist in harmony rather than in conflict. I'm Bree Castagnazzi, the co-host of Solarpunk Futures and co-editor-in-chief of Solarpunk Magazine.
And I'm Justine Norton-Kurtzen, also co-host and co-editor-in-chief of Solarpunk Magazine. Welcome to Solarpunk Futures.
Welcome to the show, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. We have a couple guests with us today from Arizona State University, which has put out a couple of climate fiction anthologies that are at least solarpunk adjacent, if not solarpunk themselves. So we're going to talk with them about those anthologies and the work they do at ASU.
All right, yeah, so in no particular order, our first guest is Joey Eschrich. Joey is the editor and program manager for the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University and assistant director of Future Tense, a partnership of ASU, Slate Magazine, and New America that explores emerging technologies, policy, culture, and society. Joey has co-edited a number of books that are fiction and nonfiction, including A Year Without a Winter from Columbia Books on Architecture in the City, Visions, Ventures, Escape, Velocities, supported by a grant from NASA and was put out in 2017, and Cities of Light, a collaboration with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and a book that we're going to talk more about today on the show.
Hey, everyone. Thanks.
And here with Joey today is Clark A. Miller. He is professor and director of the Center for Energy and Society at Arizona State University. He's the co-editor of Cities of Light 2021 and The Weight of Light 2019, two collections of solarpunk science fiction and critical scholarship exploring the future of societies powered by solar energy. He's also a member of the U.S. National Academy's Committee on Accelerating Decarbonization of the U.S. Energy System and an advisor to the Electric Power Research Institute, the City of Phoenix, and the Salt River Project on Equitable Decarbonization.
Great to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, welcome both of you. Thanks for joining us.
Yep, great to have you both. Without further ado, first question. So tell us about Arizona State University's Center for Science and the Imagination. What kind of work do you all do there?
I'll take that one. The Center for Science and the Imagination is a research unit at Arizona State University. We've been around since 2012, and we get people together to craft visions of the future that are grounded in sort of real world technological understanding and scientific research, but are also responsive to sort of social and cultural research and realities. A lot of times what this takes the form of is very much like these solar fiction and nonfiction collections that we're going to talk about today, bringing people together in either virtual or in-person settings, workshops, or sort of other structured processes for collaboration, having that unfold over a couple days, or if it's virtual, maybe a couple weeks, and then taking the energy of those conversations and gatherings and having fiction authors and artists and scholars and policy folks like come together to put all of that work into a book. And so those books often include a blend of original short fiction, illustrations and art, and then nonfiction responses that kind of jump off from the stories and expand on them in a variety of ways, talking about pathways to make those futures a reality, or talking about complexities and challenges, or what those stories about the future tell us about the present.
Very fascinating. Multimedia approach really sounds not terribly dissimilar from what we do at Solarpunk magazine.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem to me there's a bit of a zeitgeist around using storytelling kind of deliberately in this way, thoughtfully, to try to like expand conversations or bring more people into dialogues. You know, for me, I know like, and this animates a lot of the work I think at our center, is that, you know, people who don't feel like they necessarily have like a huge list of credentials around an area can still have a seat at the table. And these are issues, you know, especially when it comes to environment and energy and society, for example, that concern everybody and they touch our lives, as Clark can talk about more in myriad ways. And so those conversations can still feel really hard to get into, though, and it can feel hard to be read up enough. And I know for me anyway, when we get into a new area, we're usually doing it through a project that involves storytelling and fiction, and I'm lucky to work with all these smart people, but the stories are a gateway for me into understanding what's important, what are the sticking points and priorities in that area, what the most interesting debates are, and getting me a bit oriented. So I feel like I can then like learn more about it and have some scaffolding instead of just feeling like I'm sat at the table with a bunch of PhDs in an area that I have no background in. So stories can hopefully be like a helpful on-ramp into issues that seem complex and intimidating.
Yeah, it really is. Like you said, I think, you know, part of this like is just zeitgeist shift that's happening, the way that fiction is being used in that way. I mean, I think particularly seeing Grist and Fix moving forward with their really big and successful Imagine 2200 competition. Yeah. I think that was where, for the first time, I was sort of like, okay, cool. You know, like it's an organization, a media organization that's generally, you know, nonfiction focused, that is suddenly seeing value in fiction and storytelling from the fictional perspective to sort of get at and accomplish the same goal, put out the same message.
And that's such a high quality collection with such arresting art. I mean, but what that does too is it sort of captures and epitomizes like the energy that you see in a lot of publications. Wired publishes science fiction. The New York Times has these short sort of op-eds from the future, flash fiction pieces. MIT Technology Review does these lovely 12 Tomorrows anthologies. Issues in Science and Technology, which is part of our kind of like extended family at ASU, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine publication, does science fiction publishing sometimes. They actually recently ran one of the stories from our Cities of Light book by Deji Bryce Alucatoon, talking about the grid and electricity infrastructure. And so you do see, you know, in media organizations and nonprofits and, you know, government agencies like the EU and Fortune 500 companies, like futures and storytelling and design fiction and all of these kind of narratively infused methods being appreciated in a way. And, you know, I hope it's to the good. I know for me, it can just, you know, in an agnostic way, be a really powerful tool to help people synthesize information. And again, to kind of involve lots of people in a conversation who have different kinds of backgrounds and perspectives.
Yeah, and I think what we're trying to do that's distinct, and CSI has really been this fantastic instigator of this, is we're trying to bring that same idea, that same zeitgeist into the places in the world that are really charged with, on the one hand, analyzing the future, right? So you think about expert institutions, the National Renewable Energy Lab. In this particular case, we were working with the National Academies. Or on the other hand, inventing the future, right? If you think about science and engineering laboratories and startup companies and that are really out there trying to invent the future. If you go back a decade even, and you look at, for example, how people were talking about energy futures, you get, on the one hand, the National Academies wrote this 800-page report called America's Energy Future. It's an amazing report in some respects. There is not a single person in it in 800 pages, right? It's all technology all the time. And how you would get your head around that, if you're not an engineering expert, is just, you know, you can't do it, right? And so that was one of the kind of motivators for us to say, how do we really think about what all of that technological change will mean for people and create a set of resources that will allow people to get engaged in some of the deep choices that were laid out in that kind of a report. And so really trying to think about, how we could use storytelling to open up different ways of articulating the future and thinking about the future. It's not just about what technologies we'll have. We all know, of course, in the Solarpunk space that, when you build new kinds of technologies, you're also building new kinds of societies, new kinds of cultures, new sets of relationships between people, new kinds of values, hopefully, that people have. And so how do you bring that side of the story into our systematic efforts to, on the one hand, think about the future, analyze the future, map the future, and on the other hand, create it, right? The other stories you get are, the narratives out of these places like Silicon Valley that are these fictional, truly fictional narratives about what some utopic future is going to look like if you just adopt our technology, right? So we're trying to inject that realism, right? A kind of social realism. And that's kind of interesting in thinking about how do we use like Solarpunk, especially kind of sensibilities to tell stories that are, hopeful and optimistic, but not utopic and imaginary in that sense, right? And really bring a serious conversation for us about what are the choices that we have, not just about which technology we're going to use. Is this a nuclear future? Is this a solar future? Is this a future with coal-fired power plants that are sequestering their carbon under the ground? But really a question about what kind of choices do we have about what kind of societies we want to build for the future as well.
Yeah, I love what you said about the idea of how technology affects people being the motivation behind the anthologies that you all have put out. I know Bree had at some point kind of noticed a similar thing in Solarpunk art that's out there. There's lots of really amazing, beautiful cityscapes that show these amazing potential technologically advanced futures and the way they incorporate and sort of harmonize with nature. And it's really awesome, but you don't see people in them a lot, right? So I know that's one of the things, and I guess for any artists out there who are listening, this is our big secret. One of the things we're looking for in particular when it comes to art and our magazine over the first year is stuff that highlights people in these places and the role that people play and the effect that technology has on them. So it was pretty cool similarity there.
We've been working. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. It's cool. It's all right.
We've been working with this organization called the Land Art Generator Initiative, which holds these big global design competitions for renewable energy as public art. So they work with cities like Abu Dhabi or Copenhagen or Santa Monica. They find a space in those cities, and then they get architectural firms from all over the world to come up with these amazing ideas of how you could build sculptures with renewable energy in those spaces that would produce clean energy and yet also be educational spaces, tourist locations and things like that. But, one of the things that they love about working with us is historically those competitions, architects always stick people in their diagrams, but they don't really explore what life is like in these future cities and future spaces. And so as we've been working with them, they've really put more and more emphasis on getting people to start thinking about what kinds of communities they're creating, not just what kinds of solar or wind artworks they're creating in these futures. And now we're working collaboratively on this idea that we're calling Build Back Solar. And the idea is to think about how can we bring solar into American cities in ways that are socially beneficial and optimize really the beneficial outcomes that we can get from deploying lots and lots of solar energy.
That's fascinating. Let's go ahead and move on. Bree, do you want to ask the next question? I've already talked quite a bit.
Sure. So Clark, you're involved in another ASU program called Center for Energy and Society. What kind of work is going on there, and what is the relationship, if any, between the Center for Energy and Society and the Center for Science and the Imagination?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so we're again another research center at ASU. We don't do normal things at ASU. We only do weird hybrid collaborative kind of crazy things. And Center for Energy and Society is one of those. We have humanists and social scientists and engineers and creative folks who come together in the center to think about as we do this energy transition, how are we involving people in that conversation? What will it mean for people? And ultimately for me, the most important piece of it is how can we leverage these investments that we're talking about making? I mean, so the International Energy Agency projects that we're talking literally trillions of dollars of investments in new energy systems. That's just too much money to get an energy system that is clean, but doesn't do anything else for us, in my view, right? That otherwise replicates the energy system that we have with all of its pathologies, right? In many respects. I mean, so yes, critically important that we do that, right? That we get that clean energy future, we tackle climate change, we eliminate a lot of air pollution and water pollution and soil pollution and all that stuff that comes with fossil fuels. So critically important goal, but I still think not only morally do we have an obligation to try to get more out of those investments than just that, but I actually think that if we do figure out how to get more from that for people, they'll be more excited about making those investments, and we'll be able to do it faster and really accelerate this transition to the pace that we need to really tackle climate change. So we're really focused on this question of how can we make sure that these investments that we're making in a clean energy future are investments in an awesome human future, if you will. And that means that we think really hard about, actual energy projects, concrete energy projects, and how we design them to create social benefits on one end. And on the other end, we collaborate with the Center for Science and the Imagination on forcing us, and that's what these two books are really about, to think about the choices that we have about what kinds of renewable energy futures to build. Everybody's so focused on this, debate between solar and coal, right? Or between wind and nuclear, right? They're these big, one technology versus another. But if you just look at solar energy, and the amount of it we're going to need. I mean, everybody thinks we're going to need enough solar to power half the world's energy supply in 2050. If it's going to be clean, you just have to have a lot of solar. That's hundreds of billions of solar panels. And it turns out how you lay those down in the world, and Solarpunk is so awesome at displaying this, matters. Mm-hmm. It matters enormously. Who owns them? It matters enormously where you put them. It matters enormously if you congregate them in rural landscapes versus putting them on everybody's rooftop versus making gardens out of them. Right? It matters a lot. And so how do we help people see that those choices matter, explore those choices, deliberate those choices, and really hopefully unleash human imagination to create solar futures that we all actually want to live in.
Yeah. I mean, that's very similar, if not pretty much the exact same thing as the whole idea of a just transition, and making sure that through the transition to green energy technology, we're not replicating the same inequities and inequalities that exist under the current energy system. But I want to talk about the fiction anthologies that you all have put out. There's two of them. One was put out in 2018 called The Weight of Light, a collection of solar futures. and then a follow-up in 2020 called Cities of Light. So I'm curious what those anthologies are sort of about, what the main themes are, what the relationship is between them, if anything, other than just time. Or yeah.
I'll jump in just to get started, although I'd love for Clark to add more and help me expand. But just to start with process, and this goes back to describing a common sort of workflow or project structure for the Center for Science and the Imagination. In both cases, there was an in-person workshop that started those projects, and a series of collaborations, right? So at the Weight of Light, we had, the Center for Energy and Society and a solar research, engineering research center at ASU called QUEST, or Quantum Energy and Sustainable Solar Technologies Research Center. Big mouthful there. And then in the second book, Cities of Light, we worked with partners from ASU, of course, but then also the National Renewable Energy Lab in Colorado. And we were very lucky to do that workshop in Colorado at the NREL headquarters in Golden, Colorado, in right before the pandemic shut everything down. So we went out there in February of 2020, and it was like the last trip out of state, I think, that a lot of people took for a long while, and maybe still. And we sort of like squeezed it in. We were very lucky to be able to do it in person. It would have been trickier to do those things online. And it was really fun to have the writers and artists, and for us to be able to actually go and do that at NREL. It was kind of amazing to see all of that research space and infrastructure and see what they were doing to kind of inspire the fiction. But in both cases, we got people in the room, and they were together for 2 days. And in these workshops, we sort of move people between small group working time, large group discussions, sort of presentations and report outs on works in progress, some individual working time. We take little field trips, trying to give people lots and lots of inputs and different kinds of sort of social experiences, and emphasize the way that fiction is always about conversation and collaboration, even if all of that gets hidden and dissolved in, a lot of novels and things like that. There's always these intense social dynamics behind any work of fiction. And to build on what Clark was saying just now, the way we prompt people is not necessarily to say, like, here's, a technological brief for you to start with. It's questions about ownership, culture, community structure, to some extent geography, people building on places that they're familiar with, that they love, that they have some connection to, and trying to use what I guess we'd call like the human and physical geographies of those places, all of the unique features of those places, to kind of like build these renewable energy features on. Because what working with Clark has helped me understand better is the extent to which you're going to need bespoke solutions for different communities. And that's fairly obvious, but it's also one of those things that it's a much bigger concept the more you think about it, because the vast differences between neighborhoods, between cities, between regions all over the world, but also just within our country in the US, they're just incredible. And then you're dealing with local stakeholders and politics in each place that are really different. And so those are the kinds of those are the ends that we're putting science fiction to in these books. We're using it as a way for people to start thinking about the design of deliberative processes, institutions, ownership structures, forms of social interaction and entanglement, not just to say, oh, what's the particular solar technology we're going to need to deploy in this space, and what's the output going to be at any given time of day. So that I just wanted to foreground that working process, because I think coming out of those workshops, then we spend a few months actually editing. We are putting together fiction and nonfiction. The conversations continue digitally with these groups. They're looking at each other's works in progress. We're giving editorial feedback, but the zeitgeist of the books and the extent to which they feel connected and all part of one conversation with shared concerns and sort of different solutions to the same problems, which I think is a really cool thing about books produced this way. That all goes back to the fact that we all had this shared experience that was fairly compact and intense, but hopefully was the starting point for the book. Clark, do you want to
Sure,
talk a little bit more about the books and what's in them, as especially as someone with expertise in the field?
Well, so let me just talk about one piece of the books, which I think is really exciting and which really emerged from the first book as a theme, as an emergent theme and that is just how powerfully the city and its culture and its geography shape people's kind of understanding of social life and the way it might connect up to big energy systems. And of course, I was aware that, the history of the automobile and the internal combustion engine and gasoline and oil, that all has fundamentally transformed our urban landscapes. I was aware that the city in the 20th century, because of electricity, is a very different place than the city in the 19th century because we've created a night. And it turns out that nighttime development was really driven by the electric power industry because they had to figure out, in order to make the business model work for these large coal-fired power plants in the early 20th century, they had to figure out how to get people to buy electricity at night. So they invented nightclubs, they invented amusement parks, they invented radio and television, all with this goal of getting us to consume electricity in the dark.
My mind. Wow.
Right? So I'm aware of this history that our cities are really products of the energy systems of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But then that reemerges in the Weight of Light stories. 3 of which are about Phoenix. We did not set that, but that's just where we were doing it in Phoenix, and a lot of people knew a lot about Phoenix, so there was so it just became an emergent property. But then there was this 4th story that was about Detroit, and not only were the 3 stories about Phoenix different stories about different cities in the future in some really interesting ways. And indeed, in several of them, there are conflicts about which vision of the future we should build for Phoenix. But then this story about Detroit was just a radically different story. And I was like, wow, we can just see these kind of very different evolving notions of what we should be doing with solar energy to create different kinds of cities, different kinds of communities, and how impactful that was. So when we got to the second one, and when we worked with the National Renewable Energy Lab, we ended up working with a group there called the Center for Integrated Mobility Sciences. And so we brought in not only the solar, but the question of urban mobility as well. What's the future of the automobile and transportation, and are there alternatives to that, and so forth. And so it just made sense in that context to take this big idea that had kind of emerged from the Weight of Light and run with it. Say, well, let's look at 4 more cities, right? And so we get these really interesting stories about San Antonio and about San Juan and about Chicago and about Portland. And the Portland one, in some ways, is really meta. It's written by a student of ours who's just a fantastic young writer, Andrew Dana Hudson. And he writes this story where the central motif is this pair of sunglasses, futuristic sunglasses that are like Google or Apple Glass on steroids. Mm-hmm. And they're made by the electric utilities, and they allow the utility engineers to go out and look at a landscape, and where you and I would see solar panels on rooftops, they see flows of electricity and flows of money and flows of control and, all of this stuff layered onto their sunshades or solar shades. Solar shades is what the story is called. Mm-hmm. And it really plays into this conflict in Portland between the kind of suburban and exurban communities, and Portland itself, which is collectivist, green, and it's, you get these very different landscapes of what solar energy looks like in these 2 communities. But
yeah, that's my favorite story in the book, actually. Probably partly because it's a little bit more on the meta side, like you said. But also because I'm from Portland, and so it was interesting just to read about someone's vision of that future in that city, and just to sort of get all of the things in it that maybe people who aren't from the city don't quite pick up on, but it's a great story.
Nice when they're layered with that detail.
Totally, yeah, for sure. But we're almost out of time, unfortunately. Bree, do you want to get at the last question before we have to go?
Yeah, sure. And I would just like to, before I get to that, I would just like to say how much I believe we all appreciate this new development of art and literature functioning as science communication, because the vast majority of the global population are not academics. They don't have engineering or environmental degrees, but they need to understand these concepts because they'll be benefiting from them. So this, the effort that's been put into, creative works functioning in that regard is really, really excellent. But yes, so our last question: does ASU CSI have any other fiction projects in the works or on the horizon?
So I'll answer that first by just talking about a few other projects that we're doing that bear on kind of climate and environmental concerns, but aren't as directly related to this solar and energy futures work. And then Clark can follow up with some next steps on that. But right now, we are currently running something called the Climate Imagination Fellowship, which brings together 4 authors from different parts of the world, an author originally from India, an author based in China, one in Nigeria, one in Mexico, and they are creating original works of climate fiction that focus on positive climate futures and focus very much like the books that we've been talking about energy futures on local complexities, as well as sort of engaging the scientific consensus. So the stories that these authors are developing are in large part based in the countries that they originally from, or have these sort of like globe spanning kind of local to global or interregional connections at the heart of them. And so they're developing, the fellows are developing these pieces of climate fiction. They're each going to write a novelette, so a pretty substantial work of short fiction, as well as a collection of flash fiction stories that hopefully explore different angles or take place in different spots on the globe. And they're being inspired by a whole series of events that we've been hosting around and running up to the COP26 climate summit in Scotland. That's actually going to happen just in the beginning of November 2021. And so those events have been with the University of Liverpool, the Hay Festival, TED Countdown, so TED's kind of like, climate and decarbonization initiative, the British Library, and a bunch of other great partners. So we've been kind of putting the authors virtually, sort of off camera and on camera, in touch with policy experts and academics and sort of people who think deeply about climate justice and climate action to help tell these stories that are positive and hopeful, but are really, really grounded in all of the difficulties of the coming decades. And then we also have been doing these Everything Change climate fiction contests every 2 years since 2016, and we're planning to launch our 4th contest in 2022. And out of those, we publish an anthology. So we've published 3 volumes of Everything Change so far. The last one was in 2020, and hopefully we will be, or rather, we actually put the book out in 2021, I should say, and hopefully in 2023 we'll have the 4th volume with great, pieces of fiction from all over the world. Clark, do you want to talk just a little more about next steps for our sort of Solar Tomorrow's energy futures work?
I can, but maybe I should say first something we haven't said yet, which is important, which is both The Weight of Light and Cities of Light are free to download from the Center for Science and the Imagination website for everybody, as are many of the other anthologies that Joey was talking about. So we definitely encourage people to come to CSI's website and download what looks interesting to them and have a look. I have lots of ideas, nothing yet that has found concrete financed form, but I think that there are real opportunities as we go forward. We're really accelerating into a renewable energy transition. There's no question about that. And I think as we do that, the opportunity to help communities grapple with the kinds of questions about what kind of futures do they want to live in, and what kind of Solarpunk futures do they want to create for themselves is a real opportunity for us to get really concrete about these kind of fictional strategies and storytelling strategies and how we can use them to open up spaces for dialogues about alternative approaches to building energy futures. So I'm really excited about that opportunity. If there's opportunities that you all want to pursue going forward where we might collaboratively fundraise to do interesting stuff, let's talk about it.
Let's definitely do that. I think that sounds like a lot of fun and definitely worthwhile project of some kind, whatever that project ends up being. But yeah, and that would be great. And unfortunately, we're really out of time. But we'd love to continue this conversation. Yeah, so I mean, we'll do that offline. And two, once your next project comes out, or whatever your next thing is. You've been listening to the Solarpunk Futures podcast, a production of Android Press, brought to you by Solarpunk Magazine. To hear more episodes or learn more about Solarpunk Magazine, visit www.solarpunkmagazine.com.